Chapter 4. USP Big Sandy did not just happen. It was years-long work in progress. As our nation ran for the lead in being the strongest nation in the free world, it also ran to be the leader in incarcerating more of its citizens than any other industrialized nation in the world. The very sad reality is that the land of the free is actually less free than any other country on earth. The United States is home to 5% of the world's population, but it is also home to 25% of its prisoners. The incarceration rate that plagues the United States is 19% higher than Turkmenistan's, 36% higher than the late Fidel Castro's Cuba, and 57% higher than Russia's. The United States has a higher prisoner count than most of the world's most notorious repressive regimes. This system of mass incarceration costs the taxpayers, the government, and families of justice at least $182 billion per year. The costs associated with the system of mass incarceration include $80.7 billion for public correction agencies, including prisons, jails, and probation, $5.8 billion for prosecution, $63.2 billion for policing, only criminal law, and $12.3 billion for health care. Today, more than 2.2 million people are incarcerated in the United States. Between 1978 and 2009, the prison population in the United States rose by more than 425%. With that rise, prisons like USP Big Sandy began to pop up in poor rural areas. With new prisons came much-needed jobs for mostly poor white people, at the expense and anguish of poor Black and Hispanic communities. Today, 1 out of every 10 African Americans is in prison. Every American state has its prisons, as do most countries. Most people simply accept imprisonment or incarceration as the normal penalty for those who commit more serious crimes. In today's world, we tend to associate prison with hard discipline or punishment. It was not always that way. At their beginning, prisons were promoted as strongholds of the Enlightenment. These prisons were looked upon not only as a means to rehabilitate the criminally wicked, but to ultimately cleanse society of crime altogether. It was believed that the cleansing process, imprisonment, would make orderly societies safe for democracy. Initially, these prisons were called penitentiaries, as Big Sandy is today. This was because they promised to induce holy penitence in their prisoners. That promise is far from the truth within penitentiaries across the United States nowadays. The rise of the penitentiary is tied with the rise of American democracy. Prisons are not new. They are in fact as old as civilization itself. However, until modern times, they were seldom used to confine criminals for lengthy periods, much less for rehabilitation. In the New World, the rule of law usually relied on a much cheaper form of punishment, pain and shame. The tools of justice were branding, stocks, and the most feared, lashing with whips. The objective, according to the people ordained to administer justice, was not to cure crime, which was impossible, but to control it to some extent. To check man's inclination towards sin, the social hierarchy was enforced by a range of penalties. Free and propertied whites could circumvent even the most serious convictions with a fine. Outsiders generally faced expulsion. White servants, Indians, slaves, and freed blacks were most often punished by the lash. The gallows were always there in the background, the ultimate penalty for serious offenders and repeat offenders of all kinds. These terrible public punishments made for a great show, but local governments found it hard to control their communities' interpretations. And colonial cities were growing. Gruesome penalties discouraged juries from delivering guilty verdicts, with more crime a predictable after effect. Prominent Americans called for change. They felt bloodthirsty punishments were unfit for the budding, emergent age of the market, that the gallows were simply too harsh an instrument of discipline, and that lashing, whip-rendering actual flesh, was overly severe. Americans leaving the mother country devoted time to ending the bloody code of the old country. Kings considered their people their property, so shedding their blood came as easy as slaughtering one of their calves. Although the people of the new land pushed back against sanguinary sanctions, they also understood that there must be some punishment for one's transgressions. In a democratic society, the great land of liberty, man had to be held responsible for his actions. Man could not be permitted to do as he pleased. Thus came the proposal for a penitentiary. A medical doctor and a signer of the Declaration of Independence, Benjamin Rush, proposed that a large house be erected, capable of reforming criminals and preventing crimes. Big Sandy was being molded from the beginning of the United States, absent the reforming criminals and preventing crimes. Could Big Sandy and my 40-year sentence ever reform me? As for a place that prevents crime, violent crime is rampant in this concrete doomed castle.